Hey guys, welcome back to Ben and Buring's channel. For those of you that have not been here before, we do product reviews, tutorials, and we have a live chat feature on our website to help you through your Brew Day 911s. Check it out at benandburing.com and hope to chat with you soon. Today's video, we're actually doing a kind of an older topic about keeping your fermentation cool, which is important for temperature control. There's a very inexpensive way of doing it without having to deal with fridges and temperature controllers and things like that I don't think a lot of people talk about anymore. Let's talk about how effective it is and how you can build one for your system. Let's check it out. So for a lot of you experienced homebrewers out there, you know that temperature control of your fermentation is extremely important. And homebrewers will go to extensive lengths to make sure they're keeping their beer within the appropriate temperature range for whatever style of beer they're brewing, be it lager or ale. Some of these can get very, very complicated, including glycol chilled fermenters, which is expensive and use a lot of electricity. They're extremely effective though, and you can crash cool a lot of things, to rewiring a refrigerator or hooking it up to like an Inkbird temperature controller so that you're able to let that fridge get up to a higher temperature, like a 68, 69, 70 degrees for your ale fermentations. Now, if you're doing Kveik, yes, let it get up to 80, that's fine. But a lot of those options are very expensive. You have to buy a fridge, and if you can even find one that's used, you don't know necessarily how long it's gonna last. There's a method of cooling down your fermentation that's actually extremely inexpensive, and it was something that I did when I first started into the home brewing foray and wanting to control my temperature fermentation. It's a method that I don't see talked about a whole lot, so I'd like to kind of bring it back up for those newer home brewers that maybe aren't familiar with it or maybe haven't used it before. And it is surprisingly effective at keeping your fermentation temperatures where they need to be, and it only costs you like $25. So the basic way that you achieve the cooling of your fermentation vessel is it's basically evaporative cooling. It's not a new idea. It's nothing super fancy or complicated, but I think if more people actually gave it a try and used it, they'd realize really how effective it is. The general idea is very simple. You want to keep the outside of your fermenter wet, usually with water, hopefully water, not beer, and you blow a fan across it, and that helps to take the heat that's being generated by either the ambient temperature or the fermentation itself, and it moves it away. So it's effectively evaporative cooling. Now, your mileage may vary depending on where you live, because the higher the relative humidity, the less effective that cooling is, but I think you'll be surprised with how effective it still is up to some very, very high humidity. Now, for those of us that live in the Southwest where we tend to have more of a dry heat, our brewing season really is not very long. We get a couple of months in the winter, a little bit in the fall, and then it starts to heat up too much, and keeping fermentation temperatures cool is difficult. Because we do have such good dry air, this works very well for anybody that's in the Southwest. Now, once it starts to get into the August and September and humidity starts to rise and get into the 50%, 60% range, it actually is still surprisingly effective, especially if you're keeping this inside of your house and not in your garage. So let's talk about how effective this method is, because on the outset, especially in higher humidity environments, it sounds like it may not be super effective, but just bear with me. So for the side-by-side experiment I ran, just to get some general numbers to kind of help, I took 2 carboys and I put water in them at 100 degrees each. One of them was put in the evaporative cooling situation. The other one was just let to sit out at ambient temperature. Now, this was done in the garage, and during the week that I did the experiment, temperatures averaged about 85 degrees in the garage. So they get a little bit warmer during the day, and then at night they drop down to like 75. So it was kind of a good range. And then relative humidity for most of the week, if not all of the week, was about 20% humidity. So with both of our carboys at 100 degrees, one with the cooling fan and the water and everything on it, and the other one again at room temperature, in 3 hours our cooling carboy actually dropped from 100 degrees to 70 degrees, which was pretty quick. I was actually surprised with how well that worked. Our other carboy, however, was still sitting at 99 degrees. Obviously that thermal mass, the 5 gallons of liquid that's in there, really holds on to temperature. So that's a pretty neat effect. And you could think there may be some applications for that if you're needing to crash cool something or cool down something from a brew day. 2 hours later, our chilled carboy was down to 67 degrees, and that is really about where it stabilized and held. Our other carboy was still at 88 degrees, and that was about as low as that was gonna get for this experiment. So again, our chilled carboy, our evaporative cooler carboy vary between 67 and 70 degrees throughout the day, depending on the day and the night temperatures. Our other carboy average about 82 to 86 degrees. So you can see there's about a 16-degree variance between the two, again, at about 20% relative humidity. Now, if you're doing this in your house, you're not gonna have, hopefully, your house get up to 85, 90 degrees during the day. If you're doing this inside and your relative humidity is even high, the cooler temperatures of your house, let's say it gets up to 80 and you can cool 10 degrees below ambient, you're still sitting in a good spot. The driest air you could possibly have, you really only achieve about 20 degrees below your ambient temperature for cooling power. Now, obviously, as the humidity rises, that gap narrows. But if you are at 80 degrees and you're able to cool it 10 degrees to get you to 70, you're still made in the shade. You are still totally fine. So there's really just a couple of things that you need to build this, and we're gonna link it all below. We actually went to Home Depot and picked up a lot of this stuff, but we will have Amazon links just in case they're not near Home Depot or you just wanna build the exact same thing that we're doing. So first of all, you need a length of vinyl tubing, and you need about, I'd say 3 feet. You're not gonna use all of it, and this will give you some extra in case you make some drilling mistakes or anything like that, but about 3 feet or so. The diameter of the tubing is gonna be important, but a lot of it depends on the type of fountain pump that you get. You want to make sure that with the adapters that it comes with, that it will mate with the pump properly so it doesn't come loose and have water leaking everywhere. Speaking of the pump, a small fountain pump is really all you need. You should be able to get something very inexpensive. You just want to make sure that it has at least 24 inches of lift, because we need to make sure we're lifting it up high enough to get to the top of whatever your fermentation vessel is. If yours happens to be a little bit taller, like a keg and things, you may want to get something with a little bit more power, a little bit more lift. And you want between 50 and 70 gallons per hour. If you go lower than that, especially when you're blowing it with a fan, your carburetor can dry out and you lose all of your cooling ability. If you go higher than 70 gallons per hour, then you could end up with literally a fountain all over your house. So you want to make sure it's not gushing water everywhere. Some fountain pumps are really neat and they have a little adapter inside that you can actually adjust the flow. If you can find one of those, it does give you some control over the flow. The other thing you're going to need with this build is a drill and some drill bits. You can use anything sharp, really. That's just what you're using to punch holes into the vinyl tubing. You do want to make sure that they're relatively big and relatively clean. If they're too small and too fine, you're going to end up with a jet of water that comes out of it, and you really just want it to flow out and moisten everything on top of your fermentation vessel. Tape measure and Sharpie so you can make your marks on the tubing where you're going to punch the holes and how big your recirculating loop needs to be, and some zip ties to secure the whole thing together. The other thing you can do that is optional is you can get a plastic like Tupperware tub from Home Depot, like a clear one. Doesn't have to be very deep, just needs to hold a couple gallons of water, and that is what your entire system will rest in, which is great because you can then place it in any room in your house, preferably the coolest room in your house. If you don't want to invest in that, you can always just throw it in the bathtub, fill some water up, and it accomplishes the same thing. But keep in mind, your tub will then be out of commission for however many weeks it takes to ferment out what you're trying to do. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take your length of vinyl tubing and you're going to actually create kind of a dummy loop around the top of whatever your fermentation vessel is. You want it to kind of be somewhat wide, so you're covering quite a bit of the area, but it's important that it goes around the entire circumference of whatever your vessel is. You'll mark off where that loop is so you'll know how big to make the circle. Next, you're going to estimate the drop into your water. So depending on the height of your fermentation vessel, depends on the height down to the pump. And you'll want to mark that off as well. Now, depending on the shape of your vessel or whatever you're using, this could be different as far as the height and how it actually hangs on to your fermenter. So now that you have your marking on your tubing, you're going to start to assemble your cooling loop. The first thing you do is you take the end of the tube that will terminate at the top of your loop, fold it over by about an inch or so, and put a nice kink in it, and that will stop the water from continuing to run. This is your end point. Take a zip tie or two, I did 2 on mine, and zip tie that closed and squeeze it down as tight as you can. You don't want any leaks out of that end piece. Next, you'll take your tubing and find your second mark where you made a mark for the circumference of your cooling loop. You're going to zip tie the end of your tubing to that mark. Now don't over tighten this zip ties. These don't need to stop anything from leaking, they're just trying to hold your cooling loop together. Now, with your top loop assembled, you want to flip your tubing over because we're going to mark where the holes are going to be drilled on the underside of the tubing. It's important you flip it because if you don't, you're going to drill holes in the top of your tubing cooling, and you'll have a very pretty fountain and a huge mess on your hands. So make sure you flip it over. Take your measuring tape and your Sharpie. You're going to mark out every 2 inches along the underside of that loop. Now, I've found that 2 inches is a good spacing for the holes to make sure that if there's too many holes, you lose pressure, and so your whole carboy won't get completely saturated. And if you do too wide a spacing, there's too few holes, you kind of run into the same problem. You'll end up drying it out, which is not good. 2 inches is a good happy medium. Make sure that you're either drilling them out with a decent sized drill bit or whatever you're going to use to punch a hole in it. They need to be clean so that we're not spraying water, and they also need to be large enough so they're not spraying water. So make sure you do nice clean holes. Once you get the holes drilled out, go ahead and take your tubing and make sure you clean out any of the debris that may have fallen inside. Also, as a word of caution, don't drill too far into the tubing and go out the other side as I did. I fortunately had some waterproof tape so I could kind of tape over that little mistake. But just be gentle and careful with power tools. All right, so your cooling loop is fully assembled. You've got the holes drilled. The next step is to put a piece of fabric around your fermenter to drape on all sides. Now, that's important for surface area to make sure the cloth is taking all of the water, and when you're putting a fan on it, it is transferring that heat away, maximizing the surface area. Now, you do want to use cotton cloth because cotton likes water and it will absorb it and keep it close to your carboy. Don't do non-cotton cloths, a polyester, a synthetic, because they don't typically absorb water. So cotton is going to be your best bet. Don't use a terry cloth towel. Yes, it's cotton. Yes, it will soak up the water, but because of the thickness of it, it actually acts, I wouldn't say an insulator, but it doesn't make the most efficient cooling because it is trapping some of that water and it's not completely wicking it away. You will still get some cooling effect, but it is not the most efficient fabric to use. I like to use an old t-shirt because it drapes over the top. If you've got something like that, go ahead and use it. Once you've got your shirt dressed on your carboy, go ahead and take your cooling loop and put it on top and balance it to make sure that it's centered and is good to go. Drop your tubing down into the pump in the base of your tub, whether you're using a bathtub or just a small Rubbermaid tub. Go ahead and put a couple gallons of water in it and turn your pump on to test it, and make sure before you move it in the house that it's not going to be spraying water everywhere and that it actually does soak into the cloth. Now, it might take a minute or two because sometimes the water will run off of the cloth depending on if you've used fabric softener on it, which puts a wax in it and it won't absorb. So give it some time. Once it starts to soak up that water, it will wick across the rest of the carboy. So after about 5 minutes, you should be absolutely good. So once you've tested your pump, everything's working, everything's flowing, you can actually use it without the fan if your fermenter is getting too cold, like if your ambient temperatures aren't that bad and you've got some dry air to work with. The natural ambient evaporation will actually cool it down. It won't be quite as effective, but it gives you some temperature control. Now, if you really want to boost the cooling power, just put a small fan blowing across the surface because you're moving that heat away, you're letting that water evaporate. So it really will be effective as far as cooling goes. Now, keep in mind too, you will need to keep an eye on the water that's in the tub. You may have to add 2-3 gallons a day, depending on your humidity, to keep that thing topped up so the pump doesn't dry out. The other thing you can do optionally is to add ice to your cooling bath. If you are measuring the temperature of the water, and let's say it's measuring 67 degrees, generally the temperature inside your fermenter is about 2 degrees warmer than that on average. So you really can measure what's going on. If you don't have a tilt or something inside measuring temperature, that'll let you know about where you're at. If you cool that water down more, you will achieve somewhat of an additional cooling boost, although my experience with the experiments that I was running, I only got 2 or 3 degrees more maybe, and the ice went super fast. And I wasn't just throwing ice in there, I was chilling down half-gallon jugs of milk. Half-gallon milk jugs. I was chilling down half-gallon empty milk jugs with water and putting them in, and they would last maybe an hour or so, and they would chill it and they would come back up. But let me know your experience if you've used this before and you pre-chill your water by putting ice in there, how effective it is for you. Maybe my method could use some modifications. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching our video on how to inexpensively cool your fermentation vessel. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know if you have experience with this method, and maybe there's some better techniques or better tips I can share with other viewers as far as how to maximize that particular method of cooling. Catch you later, my friends.